Before the flood, before written history settled into stone and parchment, ancient voices whispered about beings who stood between heaven and earth. We know their name well, the Nephilim, giants of immense strength, fear, and mystery. But tonight, we are not asking who the giants were. We are asking something far more unsettling. Did the giants have wives? Imagine a world where the ground trembled not only under the footsteps of towering men, but perhaps also under the presence of towering women, figures erased from memory. Never named. Never recorded. If the Nephilim walked the earth, lived, ruled, and fell, could they truly have existed alone, or were there giantesses standing beside them, shaping a forgotten chapter of human history? This question rarely appears in sermons, textbooks, or mainstream discussions, yet it cuts straight to the heart of one of the Bible's most enigmatic passages. Genesis speaks of forbidden unions, of watchers descending, of bloodlines corrupted, but it leaves a deafening silence where the stories of women might have been. Is that silence accidental, cultural, or intentional? Across ancient civilizations, myths speak freely of colossal women titans, frost giantesses, divine queens of impossible size. Only the biblical record seems restrained, careful, selective, and that restraint forces us to ask, were these stories lost, ignored, or deliberately left untold? Tonight, we will step carefully into that silence. We will explore ancient texts, long-debated interpretations, and cross-cultural echoes that challenge what we think we know, not to sensationalize, but to understand, not to rewrite Scripture, but to question the gaps within it. If mysteries like this fascinate you, if you believe the most powerful truths often hide between the lines, then you are in the right place. Take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join a community that is not afraid to ask the questions history left behind. Because sometimes, the most haunting stories are not the ones that were written, but the ones that were never told. To understand why the question of the giants' wives refuses to fade, we must return to the moment where the mystery truly begins. After imagining a world shaped by towering figures and wondering whether they stood alone, the ancient texts draw us back to a brief but explosive passage in Scripture. In Genesis 6, the story does not unfold with detailed explanations or comforting clarity. Instead, it arrives like a sudden rupture in the narrative of humanity. The text speaks of a time when the sons of God looked upon the daughters of men and took them as wives, crossing a boundary that was never meant to be crossed. From this union emerged the Nephilim, beings remembered not for wisdom or virtue, but for power, violence, and renown. The language of Genesis is careful and restrained, yet the implications are immense. These were not merely tall warriors or exaggerated heroes. They were something different, something born from a convergence of realms that should have remained separate. Human women, bound by flesh and mortality, became entwined with beings described as divine or celestial, often understood by ancient readers as heavenly watchers who abandoned their appointed place. The result was not harmony, but corruption. The earth, the text tells us, became filled with violence, as though the very fabric of creation strained under the weight of this forbidden mingling. Centuries later, the brief letter of Jude echoes this same event with a tone of warning rather than description. Jude speaks of angels who did not keep their proper domain but left their dwelling, an act of defiance so severe that it demanded judgment. Though Jude offers no new details, his words reinforce the idea that something catastrophic unfolded in the distant past, something that reshaped both the spiritual and human worlds. Together, Genesis and Jude form a fragmented but powerful frame, hinting at a rebellion that did not remain in heaven but spilled directly into human bloodlines. This is where the mystery deepens and where the earlier questions return with greater force. If human women were drawn into this transgression, if they bore children who would become the Nephilim, what kind of world did those women enter? And more unsettling still, what became of those children as they grew? The text names the giants, describes their might, and traces the consequences of their existence, yet it leaves their family structures almost entirely in shadow. We hear of fathers who were not fully human, but nothing of mothers beyond their initial role in the union. We hear of mighty men, but no daughters, no wives, no female counterparts who shared their scale, their burden, or their fate. The silence is striking precisely because the Bible is otherwise deeply concerned with lineage. Generations are counted, names are preserved, and bloodlines are traced with care. And yet here, at one of the most dramatic turning points in the early story of humanity, the narrative contracts instead of expanding. It gives us just enough to understand the severity of the transgression, but not enough to fully comprehend the lives that unfolded within it. This restraint has fueled centuries of interpretation, not because readers wish to invent what is not there, but because the gaps themselves demand attention. Seen this way, the Nephilim are not only figures of strength, but symbols of a world pushed beyond its intended limits. Their existence explains why judgment follows, why the flood narrative emerges as a response to a corruption that had grown too deep to mend. Yet even in this explanation, the human dimension remains hauntingly incomplete. The women involved, whether ordinary or extraordinary, fade almost immediately from the record, leaving behind questions that continue to echo through theology, history, and imagination. By linking Genesis and Jude, the story reveals a pattern rather than a single event. Rebellion, transgression, consequence. Within that pattern lies an absence that is impossible to ignore. It is within that absence that the question of wives, daughters, and giant women finds its power, not as a challenge to Scripture, but as an invitation to wrestle with what the text chooses to reveal and what it leaves unsaid. Once the Nephilim step into the story, their presence feels overwhelming, yet what follows is an almost unsettling quiet. We hear of their strength, their reputation, and the fear they inspired, but when the narrative turns toward family, community, or continuity, it seems to hesitate. This hesitation is not accidental, and it is here that the absence of female giants becomes one of the most intriguing elements of the entire account. After learning of forbidden unions and hybrid offspring, the natural expectation is to find traces of mothers, daughters, and wives who shared in that extraordinary existence. Instead, the record offers silence, a silence that has echoed for thousands of years. This absence has given rise to several interpretations, each shaped by the way ancient people told their stories. One possibility is that traditions once existed but were lost to time. Scrolls decayed, oral histories faded, and countless voices disappeared long before their words could be preserved. In a world where writing materials were fragile and transmission depended on memory, entire narratives could vanish with the passing of a single generation. It is not difficult to imagine stories of giant women slipping quietly into oblivion, especially if they were never considered essential to the theological message being preserved. Yet there is another possibility, one more deliberate and more revealing of the culture that produced these texts. Ancient storytelling, particularly within the biblical world, was shaped by deeply rooted patriarchal structures. Lineage flowed through fathers and sons. Authority was measured through male succession, and history was recorded as a chain of men whose names carried inheritance and identity. Women, though vital to survival and continuity, often appeared only at moments where their presence directly affected that male lineage. Even in stories where women played decisive roles, their names and experiences were frequently condensed or overshadowed by the men around them. Seen through this lens, The silence surrounding female giants may not signal their non-existence, but rather their exclusion. If the purpose of the narrative was to explain corruption, judgment, and the breakdown of divine order, then the spotlight naturally fell on the figures who embodied power and dominance. The giants, portrayed as men of renown, became symbols of excess and rebellion. Any women who shared their stature or lived within their societies may simply have fallen outside the narrative priorities of those who recorded the story. Their lives, no matter how extraordinary, may not have served the lesson the text sought to convey. This pattern is not unique to biblical literature. Across many ancient cultures, history and myth alike often elevate male figures while allowing female counterparts to fade into the background. Battles are remembered through kings and warriors, while households, council, and daily life remain largely invisible. When applied to beings as extreme as giants, this tendency becomes even more pronounced. The record preserves what inspires fear and awe, not what sustains life or shapes relationships behind the scenes. What makes this silence so powerful is that it forces the reader to confront the limits of the record itself. The absence of female giants does not function as proof, but as a question mark embedded in the narrative. It reminds us that ancient texts were not written as exhaustive histories, but as purposeful accounts shaped by belief, culture, and intent. The writers chose what to emphasize and what to leave behind, and those choices continue to shape how later generations imagine the past. In this way, the missing voices of giant women become part of the story rather than a flaw in it. Their absence reflects how memory is constructed, how power determines what is preserved, and how entire lives can vanish between the lines of sacred history. As the narrative moves forward toward judgment and renewal, these unspoken figures linger like shadows at the edge of the text, inviting us to consider how much of the ancient world remains unseen, not because it never existed, but because no one thought to write it down. As the silence around giant women deepens, another interpretation emerges that attempts to explain not only their absence, but the strange nature of the Nephilim themselves. Building upon the idea of forbidden unions and incomplete records, some readers of scripture and ancient tradition suggest that the Nephilim were not simply powerful beings, but profoundly unnatural ones. In this view, they were hybrids whose very biology placed them outside the normal rhythms of human life, including birth, inheritance, and continuity. The early chapters of Genesis describe lifespans that stretch far beyond modern comprehension. Men live for centuries, walking through generations that rise and fall around them. When this framework is applied to the Nephilim, beings born of both heavenly rebellion and human flesh, their existence becomes even more unsettling. If ordinary humans lived for hundreds of years, how long might these hybrids have endured? Some interpretations suggest that they were not only immense in stature, but extended in time, living lives so long that they themselves became moving monuments of a broken order. From this perspective, the question of lineage changes shape. If the Nephilim endured for centuries, there may have been little urgency for succession or descendants. Their presence alone would have dominated memory and landscape alike. Villages might rise, fracture, and vanish while the same towering figures remained unchanged, watching the slow passage of generations beneath them. In such a world, legacy would not depend on sons or daughters, but on survival itself. The giants would not need heirs to be remembered. Their longevity would ensure their place in fear and legend. This idea also opens the door to another possibility, one that offers a stark explanation for the missing figures of giant women. If the Nephilim were hybrids born from a transgression that disrupted natural order, sterility may have been woven into their existence. The same crossing of boundaries that granted them power and size may have carried an unseen cost, cutting off the ability to reproduce. In this scenario, the giants would stand as a closed chapter from the moment they appeared, unable to form lasting bloodlines no matter how long they lived. If this were the case, the absence of giant women would not be a matter of lost history or cultural omission, but of biological finality. There would be no daughters to record, no wives to trace through generations, no matriarchs shaping clans of colossal descendants. The Nephilim would exist as singular figures, impressive yet isolated, embodying the consequences of a union that was never meant to endure. Their strength would be undeniable, but their future would be empty. This interpretation also casts new light on the tone of judgment that surrounds their story. The biblical narrative does not describe the giants as a thriving civilization with complex family structures. Instead, they appear as a symptom of corruption, a distortion that spreads violence and disorder across the earth. If they were indeed sterile or incapable of sustaining themselves through reproduction, their eventual disappearance would not require total annihilation. Time alone would be enough. They would simply fade, one by, until none remained. Within this framework, the silence surrounding giant women becomes part of a larger pattern. The story is not incomplete because something essential is missing, but because the beings themselves were incomplete. They stood between categories, belonging fully to neither heaven nor earth, and as a result, their existence carried limits that humans did not share. Their power could dominate an age, but it could not outlast it. This view does not close the mystery, but it reframes it. The absence of lineage, the lack of recorded wives, and the disappearance of giants after pivotal moments in biblical history all align with the idea of beings designed, by consequence or judgment, to end. In this telling, the Nephilim were never meant to continue. They were a warning written into history, not through descendants, but through their eventual vanishing, leaving behind only questions, echoes, and the unsettling reminder of what happens when boundaries are crossed. Yet the story does not rest easily with the idea that giants stood alone or faded simply because they could not continue themselves. Another stream of thought rises naturally from the questions left behind by silence, offering a different way to understand what the ancient record preserves and what it leaves behind. This perspective suggests that female giants likely did exist, not as anomalies or afterthoughts, but as natural counterparts within a world shaped by scale far beyond ordinary human experience. Their absence from the biblical narrative, according to this view, reflects not impossibility, but omission. If the Nephilim were indeed physical beings who walked the earth, lived in territories, and interacted with human societies, then it becomes difficult to imagine them as isolated figures without partners or communities. Size alone introduces practical considerations. The idea that towering beings consistently formed unions with ordinary humans raises questions about compatibility, continuity, and social structure. For some interpreters, it seems far more plausible that giants lived among their own kind, forming relationships with women who shared their stature, strength, and capacity to bear children of similar scale. This line of reasoning gains strength when the biblical silence is placed alongside the broader human tradition of storytelling. Across cultures separated by geography and time, myths consistently portray giants not as solitary males, but as entire races composed of both men and women. In Greek tradition, the Titans are not only fathers and warriors, but also mothers, queens, and figures of immense authority whose influence shapes the fate of gods and mortals alike. Norse stories speak of frost giants whose lineages include powerful women. Some feared, others revered, all essential to the unfolding of cosmic events. These narratives do not treat giant women as curiosities, but as integral parts of their worlds. The repetition of this pattern across civilizations raises a compelling question. If so many cultures instinctively imagined balance within these colossal races, why would the biblical world be the sole exception? Those who support this theory argue that the answer lies not in biology or absence, but in perspective. Ancient biblical writers were not attempting to catalogue every aspect of existence. They were crafting theological narratives shaped by their understanding of order, authority, and inheritance. In such a framework, male figures naturally dominated the record, while women, regardless of their size or significance, often remained unnamed. When this cultural lens is applied to the Nephilim, the silence surrounding giant women becomes easier to understand. If giants were remembered primarily as symbols of violence, corruption, or rebellion, then the narrative focus would remain fixed on those aspects that served the message. The daily lives of their communities, the roles of their wives, and the experiences of their daughters would have been seen as secondary, even irrelevant, to the moral weight of the story being told. This interpretation also offers a more cohesive picture of how giant societies might have functioned. Rather than imagining isolated figures appearing suddenly and vanishing without context, it envisions structured communities, families, and generations that existed long enough to leave impressions on human memory. The fear and awe attributed to giants would not stem solely from individual encounters, but from the presence of entire populations whose scale challenged humanity's place in the world. Under this view, the biblical narrative does not deny the existence of giant women. It simply passes over them. Their stories remain untold not because they were insignificant, but because the writers chose to preserve only what aligned with their theological purpose. The result is a record that feels incomplete, not because it is flawed, but because it reflects human priorities shaped by culture and belief. In this way, the possibility of female giants becomes less speculative and more interpretive. It rests not on adding new details to ancient texts, but on reading them alongside the wider human tradition and recognizing the patterns of omission that run through history. The silence, once again, speaks. It suggests that behind the towering figures named in Scripture may have stood equally formidable women whose lives unfolded beyond the edges of the written word, shaping a world that history chose not to remember. As the biblical narrative moves forward, the giants who once seemed untouchable begin to fade from the center of the story. Their presence does not vanish in a single moment, but recedes gradually, like a storm breaking apart after dominating the horizon. Battles once fought in fear start to shift in tone, and the giants, once symbols of overwhelming power, become figures who can be challenged, resisted, and ultimately overcome. This slow decline marks more than the fall of individual warriors. It signals the end of an entire era. Nowhere is this transition more vividly captured than in the story of David and Goliath. Goliath stands as a final echo of a world that once belonged to giants, towering over ordinary men and confident that size alone guarantees victory. Yet the narrative no longer bends around him. Instead, it centers on a young shepherd whose strength does not come from stature, but from faith, resolve, and clarity of purpose. When Goliath falls, it is not merely the defeat of one formidable opponent. It is a symbolic turning point, a declaration that the age of giants is drawing to a close. From this moment onward, giants no longer dominate the landscape of biblical history. They appear less frequently, their influence diminished, their terror reduced to memory and legend. Humanity steps forward into a new chapter, no longer living beneath the shadow of colossal beings who seemed to blur the line between the earthly and the divine. The story shifts its focus toward human responsibility, moral choice, and the unfolding of covenant and redemption. The giants recede, not because they were invincible, but because their time had passed. Yet even as their era ends, the questions surrounding them remain unresolved. The biblical record closes the door on their dominance, but leaves open the mystery of their lives. Were there giant women who witnessed this decline from within, whose stories vanished as their world faded? Were there daughters, mothers, and wives who lived through the same turning of the ages, only to be swallowed by silence as history moved on? Scripture does not answer these questions, and perhaps that uncertainty is part of its enduring power. The disappearance of the giants leaves behind more than empty spaces in the text. It leaves symbols that continue to resonate, Giants come to represent forces that appear overwhelming in their time, yet are ultimately temporary. Their fall reminds us that no power, no matter how immense, is immune to change. The mystery of the giantesses remains unresolved, not as a failure of the story, but as an invitation to reflection, urging us to consider how history remembers strength and how easily entire lives can be lost when memory narrows its focus. As this journey through ancient questions comes to an end, thank you for spending your time here, for listening, and for allowing curiosity to guide you into the quieter corners of biblical history. If this exploration has sparked new thoughts or deepened your sense of wonder, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep these thoughtful conversations alive and allows us to continue exploring the mysteries that still whisper from the pages of the past.